The morning of October 6, 1973, was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Across Israel, the nation had come to a standstill. Synagogues were full, roads were empty, and radio stations had gone silent in observance of the Day of Atonement. It was a day of fasting, prayer, and reflection. But at 2 p.m., the air raid sirens began to wail across the country, shattering the sacred silence. Egypt and Syria had launched a massive, coordinated surprise attack on two fronts, and Israel was caught almost completely unprepared. The Yom Kippur War would become one of the most dramatic and consequential conflicts in Middle Eastern history. In just 19 days of intense fighting, it would bring the world to the brink of nuclear confrontation, reshape the political landscape of the region, and shatter the myth of Israeli invincibility that had been built up since the stunning victory of the Six-Day War just 6 years earlier. This is the story of how Israel went from the edge of catastrophic defeat to a hard-won military victory, and how that victory would paradoxically pave the way for peace. To understand the Yom Kippur War, we need to go back to June 1967. In the Six-Day War, Israel had achieved what seemed like an impossible military triumph. Facing the combined armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, Israel had not only survived, but had captured the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan. The victory was so complete, so overwhelming, that it created a sense of invincibility within Israel. The Israeli Defense Forces were seen as unbeatable, their intelligence services as infallible. This confidence would prove to be a dangerous illusion. For Egypt and Syria, the humiliation of 1967 was unbearable. Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, had died in 1970, and his successor, Anwar Sadat, was initially dismissed by many as a weak transitional figure. But Sadat was far more cunning and determined than his critics realized. He understood that Egypt could not continue to accept the loss of the Sinai Peninsula, and he knew that diplomacy alone would not force Israel to return the territory. War was necessary, but not the kind of war that Egypt had fought in 1967. Sadat didn't need to destroy Israel, or even defeat it decisively. He needed to break the stalemate, to shatter Israeli complacency, and to create the conditions for serious negotiations. Syria's president, Hafez al-Assad, had his own motivations. The loss of the Golan Heights had been a strategic disaster for Syria, and Assad was determined to reclaim the territory. Unlike Sadat, Assad genuinely believed that a military victory over Israel was possible. The two leaders began coordinating their plans in secret, with support from the Soviet Union, which supplied both countries with modern weapons, including advanced anti-aircraft missiles and anti-tank guided missiles that would prove devastatingly effective. The planning for the attack was meticulous. Egypt and Syria chose Yom Kippur for their assault because they knew that Israel would be at its most vulnerable. Military leave would be at its highest, roads would be empty, and communications would be difficult. They also chose the timing carefully. The attack would come during Ramadan, the Islamic holy month, which provided religious motivation for Arab forces while also serving as cover for the massive military buildup. Egyptian forces conducted repeated exercises along the Suez Canal, training for the crossing while simultaneously desensitizing Israeli observers to the site of Egyptian military activity. Israeli intelligence, despite its vaunted reputation, failed catastrophically. The Mossad and military intelligence had become victims of what analysts call conception, a fixed mindset that blinded them to the evidence in front of them. The prevailing conception was that Egypt would not attack until it had aircraft capable of striking deep into Israel, and Syria would not attack without Egypt. Even as evidence of an impending attack mounted in the days before Yom Kippur, Israeli intelligence chiefs dismissed it. When the warning finally came, it arrived less than 24 hours before the attack, far too late for a full mobilization of Israel's reserve forces, which formed the bulk of its military strength. At 2 p.m. on October 6th, the war began with a thunderous barrage. On the southern front, Egyptian forces launched a massive artillery bombardment across the Suez Canal, while Egyptian aircraft struck Israeli positions in the Sinai. Then came the crossing. Using high-pressure water cannons to blast through the sand embankments of the Bar-Lev line, Egypt's defensive fortifications along the canal, Egyptian infantry and engineers poured across on boats and bridges. They brought with them thousands of RPGs and Saga anti-tank missiles, weapons that would prove devastatingly effective against Israeli armor. Simultaneously, on the northern front, Syria launched its assault on the Golan Heights with a massive armored force of over 1,400 tanks, supported by artillery and aircraft. The Syrians outnumbered the Israeli defenders by more than 10 to 1. If Syria could break through and descend from the Golan Heights into the Galilee, the heartland of northern Israel would be exposed. The first days of the war were catastrophic for Israel. In the Sinai, Egyptian forces overwhelmed the Bar-Lev line fortifications. Israeli counterattacks were thrown back with heavy losses as Egyptian infantry dug into defensive positions, used their anti-tank missiles to destroy Israeli tanks at ranges where the tanks couldn't effectively fight back. Israeli aircraft, attempting to provide support, were shot down in alarming numbers by Egyptian surface-to-air missiles. The doctrine of rapid armored counterattacks that had worked so brilliantly in 1967 was failing disastrously. On the Golan Heights, the situation was even more desperate. Syrian tanks poured through the Israeli defenses, and for a time, it seemed that nothing could stop them from breaking through entirely. Israeli tank crews fought with desperate courage, often outnumbered 10 or 20 to 1, buying time with their lives for reinforcements to arrive. In one legendary engagement, a force of fewer than 200 Israeli tanks held off more than 1,400 Syrian tanks in what became known as the Valley of Tears. The battle raged for 4 days, and when it was over, the valley was littered with hundreds of destroyed Syrian tanks. The Israeli defenders had held, but just barely. As news of the disasters spread through Israel, the mood shifted from shock to something approaching panic. Prime Minister Golda Meir and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, the hero of 1967, met in emergency sessions. Dayan, usually confident to the point of arrogance, spoke of the possible fall of the Third Temple, a reference to the destruction of ancient Jewish kingdoms. There were discussions of preparing Israel's nuclear weapons as a last resort. The nation that had seemed invincible just days before was now facing the possibility of destruction. But Israel's military, though bloodied, was not broken. Reserves were mobilized with remarkable speed, and within days hundreds of thousands of Israeli soldiers were in uniform and moving to the fronts. On the Golan Heights, Israeli forces not only stopped the Syrian advance, but began pushing back. By October 10th, Israeli tanks had recaptured almost all of the Golan Heights and were advancing into Syria itself, moving toward Damascus. Syrian forces, which had come so close to victory, were now in danger of collapse. In the Sinai, the situation was more complex. Israeli commanders, eager to strike back, launched a series of poorly coordinated counterattacks that were repulsed with heavy losses. But Israeli forces began to identify weaknesses in the Egyptian position. The Egyptian army had advanced to a depth of about 10 kilometers from the canal and then stopped, remaining under the protective umbrella of their surface-to-air missiles. This caution created an opportunity. On October 15th, Israeli forces under General Ariel Sharon launched a daring counterattack, finding a gap between the Egyptian Second and Third Armies. Israeli forces crossed the Suez Canal, moving into Egypt proper, and began destroying the Egyptian missile sites. With the missile umbrella gone, Israeli aircraft could operate freely, and they devastated Egyptian forces. Israeli tanks rampaged through the Egyptian rear, cutting off the Egyptian Third Army and threatening to encircle the Second Army as well. The tables had turned completely. But the war was no longer just a regional conflict. The United States and the Soviet Union had both become heavily involved. The Soviets had begun a massive airlift of weapons to Egypt and Syria, and the United States responded with its own airlift to Israel. As Israeli forces advanced toward Damascus and threatened to destroy the Egyptian armies, the Soviet Union began making threats of direct military intervention. On October the 24th, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev sent a message to US President Richard Nixon suggesting that the two superpowers intervene jointly to stop the fighting, and hinting that the Soviet Union might act unilaterally if the United States refused. Nixon responded by placing US forces on DEFCON 3, the highest state of peacetime military alert. For a few tense hours, the world teetered on the edge of a superpower confrontation. The crisis was diffused through diplomacy. A ceasefire was arranged through the United Nations, though it took several attempts before it held. By October 25th, the fighting had largely ended. Israel had achieved a clear military victory, having recovered from the initial disasters to push deep into both Syria and Egypt. But the cost had been enormous. Israel had lost over 2,600 soldiers killed, a staggering number for a small nation. Egypt and Syria had suffered far higher casualties, with estimates ranging from 8,000 to 18,000 dead. The political consequences of the war were profound and unexpected. In Israel, the initial failures led to a political earthquake. Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan were forced to resign, and the Labour Party's decades-long dominance of Israeli politics began to crumble. The myth of Israeli invincibility was shattered, replaced by a more sober understanding of the nation's vulnerabilities. But in Egypt, Anwar Sadat emerged as a hero. He had not won the war militarily, but he had achieved his strategic objective. The crossing of the Suez Canal and the initial victories had restored Egyptian pride and broken the psychological stalemate. Sadat now had the political capital to pursue peace. In 1977, in one of the most dramatic diplomatic moves of the 20th century, Sadat traveled to Jerusalem and addressed the Israeli Knesset, offering peace in exchange for the return of the Sinai Peninsula. The visit led to the Camp David Accords in 1978 and a peace treaty in 1979, the first peace agreement between Israel and an Arab state. The Yom Kippur War demonstrated that even the most sophisticated military and intelligence establishments can fall victim to their own assumptions. It showed that surprise and determination can overcome technological superiority, at least initially. But it also demonstrated the resilience of democratic societies under pressure and the ability of military forces to recover from disaster through courage and adaptability. Most importantly, it proved that wars, even victorious ones, are costly and traumatic enough to make peace worth pursuing. The war that began on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar would ultimately lead not to more conflict, but to the first real peace between Israel and its neighbors, a peace that, despite all the challenges and setbacks of the decades since, has endured.